Morning, and very good to see many of you here. We are organizing the Populism and Civic Engagement conference this week, which is happening in person yesterday in Brussels, but also online in the seminar. So we're very happy to welcome you today in the first online session of several ones that will come today and tomorrow. So we hope you'll have an interesting and thoughtful discussion with each other. But first, we're going to listen to the presentation by Marco and Martin. Enjoy. If you want to ask questions, maybe do that in chat first so that we can then answer them later. Thank you.
Okay, good morning from Salzburg. My name is Martin Dolezal, and together with my colleague from the University of Salzburg, we are going to talk about the issue understanding the populist sympathizer. Slide 2, please. So there's a debate that you're all familiar with, how we can understand populism. Is it just dissatisfaction? Is it protest, or is it actually a genuine ideology? And in our presentation, we follow the ideational theory, and we define populism as a combination of three different aspects. This is people-centrism, anti-elitism, and Manichaeism. And the question we try to answer is, who are the populist sympathizers? Existing research said that typically men are populist sympathizers, perhaps the less educated segments of society, and maybe populist sympathizers are also anti-democrats. Other researchers say that the populist voter does not exist, so it's always differences between countries or differences between parties. So the aim of our presentation is to compare the best available data with existing research, and we have to stress that we focus on the individual level only, on the micro level. We do not talk about the system level, and we only talk about the demand side of populism, not about the supply side. And we want to give you a broad picture, so we are not interested in country or party-specific factors. So how can we define the populist sympathizers? We use vote choice in recent national elections, so we focus on voters. In the second step, we therefore need to classify the party choice of our voters, and we classify the parties first into populist and non-populist parties, where we use the non-populist parties as reference category. And in the second step of our presentation, we distinguish between left populist and right populist, but again, we will use non-populist parties and voters as reference category. As source, we use the well-known The Populist, which is a joint effort by about 80 academics. As I said, we always compare two groups of party voters, and another approach would have been to include non-voters as a third distinct group, but in our presentation, we exclude these people. Which data do we use? For the micro-level data, we use the comparative studies of electoral systems, the module 5.3. You see the 15 countries that are included in the survey. The survey has many advantages, especially almost all relevant variables are included, but there's one major disadvantage. Eastern Europe is hardly covered. I therefore said the two countries that we have in bold, it's only Hungary and Lithuania, and this means that we cannot do any systematic comparison between Western and Eastern Europe. And the classification, as I said before, follows the populist. All in all, we have 205 parties in the survey, and 34 of them are defined as populist. So now I want to proceed in several steps. The first step is the demographic profile, the social structural profile of populist voters. Existing research said that rather old people, less educated, and typically males vote for populist parties. And our data, the results are coefficients of logistic regressions, partly support this existing research. Not so in terms of age. Here we see only a very small effect, and to the other side, so younger people, but we see highly significant impact of being male, low education. People who vote for populist parties also live in poorer households, And it's interesting, if you compare those who are unemployed with those who are active in the workforce, we don't see a significant effect. We see a significant effect if you compare to those who are outside the labor force. So these people do not typically vote for populist parties. And an additional factor is religiosity or attendance, church attendance. Here we see that those who are religious are underrepresented in the electorate of populist parties. There's one important variable missing in our data set, and this is place of residence. We do not have this data for Britain, Italy, and the Netherlands. In the other countries, populist voters rather live in the countryside. They are less likely to live in small and especially in large towns. In the next step, we include political interest. Existing research, there's a quote, says that voters of populist parties are not interested in politics. They never read about politics or switch to another channel when a political program is shown on TV. Interestingly, that our data do not support these findings. You can see here the additional impact of three variables: political interest, interest or following politics in media, as well as internal efficacy. And you can see that when we additionally include these variables in our model, the other variables from the slide before are included, we do not see any significant effect. So here we actually have another result which somewhat deviates from existing research. The next step is ideology, support for democracy. Typically, existing research said that populist voters are supporters of democracy, even though they are less satisfied. So this is a broad picture. And if you go into details, we would say that voters of populist parties do not really follow the idea of representation. They're rather interested in a direct implementation of the general will. So to say, they are followers of a Rousseauan idea of democracy. And again, if we use our new data to check this, we see that, in fact, dissatisfaction, I have to say, with democracy is very strong. Votes of populist parties are not close to any party. They are to the right, and there's a certain wish for a strong leader. But I have to say that it's not so easy to interpret this result, because in the survey, this is rather support for someone who bends a little bit the rules. So it's not a genuine anti-democratic sentiment, but let's say a more authoritarian leadership focused idea of democracy. But we cannot say based on our data that voters of populist parties are anti-democrats. The next step is including policy attitudes. And here existing research typically focuses on parties who are either on the left or on the right side, so either left or right-wing populists. Here in this table, you see the results still for all populist parties. And what you can see is that it is anti-migration, which is a strong predictor for voting populist parties, whereas economic left-right is by far less important. You can directly compare the magnitude of the coefficient because the scale is the same. Why is this? The major reason is that right-wing populist parties are by far more common throughout Europe. This is a typical difference when you compare, for example, Europe and Southern America. And the fifth and last step is including populist attitudes. The impact of populist attitudes in explaining vote choice on the individual level has so far been rarely explored because there's still an ongoing debate on measurement. Here you can see that populist attitudes significantly contribute to understanding or identifying the votes of populist parties, and the effect size is more or less similar to the anti-migration issue that you saw before. On the left bottom, you see that we have some problems with our data because in Ireland and Greece, the wording was somewhat different for the Manichaean item. And in Sweden, we didn't have this item in the survey. It's not part of the survey. Therefore, we had to set every voter for a specific value. Okay, this was the first part of the presentation that defined or compared populist parties and non-populist parties. And now we look at differences within the populist camp. But again, as a reference, we will use the non-voters. Marco, please. I can't hear you.
Sorry. Great. Now it works, right? There we go. Sorry. Okay, so what we presented until now was an overview of all populist parties, be it left-wing, right-wing populist parties, or centrist populist parties. And I now want to walk you through a bit of the of telling apart left populists from right populists. And in fact, there are different approaches in the literature and also in our PACE project. For example, the approach of Takis Papas, who is a member of the project, is that the difference is more between populists and then nativists on the other side, which is more a form of exclusionary attitudes. And the other one, and more a larger approach, is, as I said, to tell apart left from right-wing populists. And both groups then are under the umbrella of populists. What is the crucial factor to tell them both apart is the host ideologies. So as we are working with populists as an ideational approach, there's a host ideology that the parties add to. And now for our analysis, we found all over Europe that we have populists that add a far left host ideologies. Those are 4 parties, for example, Linke in Germany and Syriza in Greece. In the far right are 19 parties, the FPO and AfD, for example. And then also there's quite a large group of centrist populists who are neither far right nor far left. And just as an example, we picked Germany and France to just the two largest countries, and also they have forms of both left and right-wing populism. Let me just walk you through the numbers a bit. And what is most important here, we can see basically the host ideologies, the main host ideologies. Firstly, the economic left-right and also the anti-migration are most of the numbers are statistically significant. So we can see for the right-wing populist parties that there is they focus on anti-migration as a host ideology. We see it both in Germany and France. On the other hand, the left-wing populist parties seem to focus more on an economic host ideology. So we see the negative effects of the left in Germany and in France also. What we also can see, again, the negative effects for satisfaction of democracy. What we saw overall seems here also to be applied to both left and right, even though we don't have a significant effect in France for the left. And then overall, we can see that the populist attitudes, the last point that Martin just mentioned, is most of the time statistically significant and positive, except for Die Linke in Germany, which might just be a classification problem. But we're happy to discuss maybe single cases also after the presentation. Right. Martin, do you want to make the conclusion then?
Okay, I can do it. So let us conclude the presentation with wanted to give you a broad overview. So we are not interested, or at the moment we were not interested in country or party-specific factors. We did not consider them. Regarding the social demographic profile, you could see that indeed male voters are more likely to vote for populist parties, especially less educated voters, voters from poorer households, and voters who are not religious. Regarding political interest and similar phenomena, we did not find any difference from other party voters, but of course, maybe there are strong differences to non-voters. This is something we did not analyze. Regarding ideology and democracy, you can see that dissatisfaction with the state of democracy is typically something that characterizes voters for populist parties. Even more, they're not close to any party, and most of them, not all, but most of them express a wish for leadership, for leaders. But we would argue, based on the data we have, within the democratic context, this is not so easy to interpret this item. The policy attitudes, you can see that if we put all populist parties together, we saw that anti-migration is much more important than the economic attitudes. The main reason for this is the predominance of right-wing populist parties in Europe. And populist attitudes prove to be highly significant factors, even in a full model. So if we, after controlling for all the other social demographic, attitudinal, etc. factors. And in the final step, we presented you a short comparison of left and right-wing populists. And here you can see that host ideology indeed is highly relevant, whereas the second issue is not really distinctive. Here the positions are more or less centrist, or not really significantly different from the attitudes of the voters for non-populist parties. That's all for the moment. Thank you very much for your attention.
Maybe I stop sharing then, right? Mm-hmm. And yeah, we're open to questions, discussion points, whatsoever.
Okay. I'll ask a question. Do you sort of broadly characterize the populist voter, but do you know anything or suspect anything about, I don't know, how country or different class moderate this? So maybe that, you know, men are more populist sympathizers than women, but it may be due to being in certain countries or certain applications or something. Do you have any idea how this breaks down any further?
So we also looked at country differences, and some of the country differences are really strong. I think a really interesting example is looking at Hungary, because here we have a populist party, which is the dominant party and which is in power. And in this country, for example, the voters for populist parties are extremely satisfied with democracy. So they're not unsatisfied, but they're very satisfied. So you can see that the context does matter. Bruce, did we lose you?
No, thank you. That was a good answer.
I can only see your name, but
it's the connection.
Any other questions? You can also post them in the chat if you want, or just unmute yourself.
So I'm going to ask another question then. I've got lots of questions. So you're familiar with the possible causal roots that Russia identified Yeah.
Mm.
Or at least vaguely remember them. Do these results sort of support or not support those routes in certain circumstances? Or can you relate them to the causal routes that Russia described? I think Russia will probably go into these in another session. I would guess later today, maybe Russia can say.
So I think it's not so easy to answer. Maybe Marco can help me, but I will try it. I think what we can see is that economic factors, broadly speaking, are not very important. So what we found interesting, especially, was that the unemployed are not more likely to vote for populist parties. That economic left-right attitudes are not really important, except, of course, for left-wing populist parties. What we cannot show with our data is whether context factors based on the economic cycle, or differences between countries really have an impact. So this is something which we didn't show, and it's also quite difficult to talk about causality. So I think it's more safe to talk about associations and to talk about the profile that we have.
Yeah. I'm not asking you to infer causality, but your data might, for example, go against one or two of the roots of the causality that Russia identified in certain circumstances.
Okay. Maybe Russia could say whether this supports.
Sorry.
Okay, so I may say a few words. Please speak.
I have a lot of feedback.
Actually, I presented yesterday several causal models, and the factors, the economic factors, fall under what we call situational mechanisms, which explain how crisis, be it economic, be it political crisis, lead to crisis of legitimacy that might lead to increase in attitudes of populist attitudes. And the economic factors, reviewing the literature, and also basing our conclusions on some of the data that your team, Martin, provided, but it was really a very selective set of, we had, I think, 15 voters for 15 populist parties in Europe that were in the set, and we asked you to study the causal factors, 4 causal factors, 2 of which were economic and 2 of which were cultural factors. What these factors have as an effect on increase of populist attitudes, and the findings were, of course, mixed in different cases of populist voters, but generally the conclusion was that in more cases you have the effect of cultural factors more strongly pronounced than economic factors. And actually, the factors that we asked you to check were mostly more complex economic related factors, like feeling of relative deprivation, sense of subjective relative deprivation, or how widespread among populist sympathizers is the attitude of increasing governmental action to counter inequality. So these were the 2 economic factors that were studied, and in very few of the cases they were found to positively correlate with populist sympathizers, with increasing their populist sentiments. So, and I was glad to see that in your new research that you presented here, this is more or less confirmed. And also the cultural factors that were studied were also more or less shown to be more effective in bringing up populist attitudes.
I have to say there's an additional variable that is actually missing in the CSCS, and this is attitudes towards social liberalism. So in another study we did with European social survey data, we could include these attitudes, but for this presentation it wasn't possible to include it because we simply don't have this data.
And one more thing. Actually, Daniel will present on populism in Central and Eastern Europe tomorrow, where he will address also issues of economic and cultural factors, but in the narrower context of Central and Eastern European populism rather than the wider context. So maybe this could fill more detail in what was more or less missing from the data presented here. But on the causal models, I can share my presentation with the audience, but it was presented yesterday in the on-site part of the conference. So there will be no further presentation online, but I can share the presentation itself. Yes.
I'm not sure whether that's possible in this system, but yeah. That session with on central and radical populism in Central and Eastern Europe is 1:30 tomorrow, if you want to join that.
Well, can I ask a question, Bruce? It's Daniel here.
Yes, of course.
Okay, Martin. Well, just a few remarks on these causal mechanisms. Actually, I think our team is happy that your results confirm well the lack of significance of economic factors, or lack of strong influence of economic factors. We were reviewing, of course, the literature, and did ask you to provide some further evidence. And from what appeared from this research was that poverty, direct indicators of deprivation somehow are not strongly correlated with voting for populist parties. And it seems that your findings, new findings, support that. That's why we tried to seek for more complex forms of deprivation, like relative deprivation. Of course, you know, it's more difficult to study such indicators. At least what we did didn't show any significant results. And in fact, there were some puzzling results that I'm going to speak about tomorrow. So I think that this part of the research largely confirms the conclusions in our causal model report. I just wanted to ask you a question about the relationship between voting for populists and populist attitudes. There is a strong correlation that you find that people having populist attitudes, yeah, they tend to vote for populist parties, and other research also supports this. Here I could refer to the populism barometer, which German colleagues have introduced. They also argue that there is this strong correlation between having populist attitudes and voting for populist parties. This seems to confirm the hypothesis that we're talking about an ideological phenomenon, that a large part of the voters of these parties, they do have certain ideological positions. But interestingly, actually, there is also a large section of these voters that are not so ideologically motivated. And that's why in our research with Ruja, we try to distinguish between ideological voters driven by such concerns, and also strategic voters that might be driven by some other more contextual concerns pertaining to specific forms of dissatisfaction with democracy, or not so much democracy, but party competition. So they might try to achieve specific strategic results in party competition. So I wanted to ask you about well, this possibility to study, in addition to ideological factors for voting for populists, some more strategic in their nature factors. So what is the state of this research in your view? Is it possible, and so on?
What we can do is look at if there's a difference between loyal voters, so who voted for the Populist Party at the election that we have data for, plus who also said that in the recall question that they voted for the Populist Parties the election before. So this is something we could do. So we could define more or less the core of populist voters and distinguish this from a second group from people who change parties, for example. So this would be a quite easy strategy, but of course it's always problematic to use this variable because very often people don't know which party they voted for 4 or 5 years before. They don't want to say, etc. So it's not so easy really to define this this core. Another possibility would be to distinguish between, let's say, populist extremists, so who really score on the highest end of the scale, and check whether they are different in terms of social demographic factors or other attitudinal factors from the other voters. So this would be 2 strategies that might be possible to apply with this kind of data that we have.
Okay, any other questions or comments? Nobody else? Otherwise, we could also stop it here, but I would really like to know if there's any other questions. Okay, so I think for now we can finish the session here then. Or maybe Martin or Marco, you want to add anything else?
Not from my side. So as we said, it's been more or less an overview, and all those questions are indeed relevant, and also especially the last question, maybe adding to that, why exactly voters vote who they vote for needs further investigation, obviously, and parts of that we're doing within the project, but also beyond the project, we still need to focus probably more on details and also on the mechanisms in voters' decision making in a way. So yeah, all we could do today was giving a rather broad overview of associations in a way. But yeah, thank you very much for attending and listening, asking questions.
Yes, thank you very much. I think we can then round this session off here, and we would be happy to see you in other sessions, which will happen today. So we have at 11:30 Central European Time, there's Roxana who will present about the European Democracy Labs. In the afternoon at 1:30 today, there's Bruce and Ruth. And after that, also Robert, who will explain about his dashboard. So please join us again and make sure that you will tell others also about this session. So thank you so much and see you later.
Thank you.
Goodbye.